And I'm going to talk to you about one particular person who I think might be the most interesting fellow I've ever researched in all my years. His name was Peter Kropotkin, and what I want to show you is how he fundamentally changed the way that we think about science, evolution, and human behavior, how he almost single-handedly made people in science realize that cooperation and altruism can be the product of natural processes like evolution. So if anybody in the audience knows about Peter Kropotkin already, my guess is that the reason that you know about him is that he's also, at the time, he was the world's most famous anarchist. He was somebody who traveled around the world promoting political anarchy. At the same time, he was also developing an evolutionary theory for goodness and cooperation and altruism. And I want to show you how both of those things developed in parallel and how over time they really became one thing to Peter Kropotkin. And I want to do this by sort of walking you through his life, and you can see how these ideas began to develop and all of the twists and turns that came along the way. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off at a very, very young age for Peter Kropotkin, because something happened in his life when he was very, very young that really transformed him and led him down the path that he eventually took. Kropotkin came from a family that long ago were truly considered princes. And by the time he was born, they were princes in name, but not really in power. They were basically very, very rich lineage that could call themselves princes, although they didn't have the sort of governmental prince-like power that they used to. They had 1,200 serfs and a number of different estates that they lived in. His father was a military man who had made his name under Tsar Nicholas. And so what happened was that in 1850, there was a big, big celebration of Tsar Nicholas's 25th anniversary in power. And this is important because a strange series of events happened. This happened, the ball that we're looking at here, this took place in Moscow. And that's where Kropotkin's family was. And what the Tsar did was he brought in all of the rich folks from around Moscow, and for entertainment, they had about 50 or 60 young boys, 8 to 10 years old. Each one of them was dressed up in the costume of a particular region of Russia at the time, and they basically marched in front of the Tsar as a form of entertainment for everybody at the ball. And one of the children got sick. And because Peter Kropotkin's family was fairly well known, they went to his mother and father and they said that they needed a little boy who was about 8 years old who could fit the costume of the young boy who had gotten sick. So Peter ended up going to the ball in this costume. And for some reason, as he marched past the Tsar took an immediate liking to this little kid and actually called him and his parents and his father over and said he wanted to talk with him. And he seemed to, for reasons that we're not quite sure, become just enamored with this little 8-year-old boy who was already a very smart little boy. And by the time that evening was finished, the Tsar had told Peter's father that Peter was the kind of child that he wanted to be one of the leaders of the next generation of Russia. And when that happened, what the Tsar did was he assigned those children to a special thing called the Corps of Pages. So basically, Peter Kropotkin was 8 years old, and the Tsar said when he gets old enough, which was 15, I want him to become part of this school called the Corps of Pages. This is where the next generation of leaders in Russia was trained. As Peter got older, before he went into the Corps of Pages, which he really didn't have much of an interest in because it typically led you into a military career, and ever since he was even 8, he had no interest in the military at all. But as he was maturing, what happened was, because his family was quite wealthy, what these wealthy families did was they hired tutors for their children who would come in, typically from the university, and teach them privately. And one of the tutors that came into Peter's house was spreading the word of this early philosophy of political anarchism. Now, Kropotkin's father didn't know about this. He would have been furious. But the tutor was teaching Peter all about this political theory of anarchism. And young Peter Kropotkin became really, really fascinated with these ideas about anarchy. And so I'm not an expert on anarchy, but basically the idea is that government is the problem rather than the solution. That anarchists argue that people will naturally cooperate with each other if they're left in small groups and not governed by some state authority that tends to make things worse rather than better. And of course, you can imagine the Tsar and the political institution in Russia at the time was quite concerned about anarchists. And Peter was beginning to read this literature even when he was 12 years old. For example, when he was 12 years old, he learned a great deal about the French Revolution, which wasn't anarchy per se, but sort of the same kind of get rid of the leadership approach. And from that point in his life on, he dropped the word prince before his name. He said he was no longer going to call himself Prince Peter Kropotkin, even though he could do that, and everybody else who could have would have. But he dropped the prince out of his title when he was 12 years old. So he starts learning these underground ideas on political anarchy. When he gets to be 15 years old, of course, that's when he has to go to this corps of pages that the Tsar sends the next generation of leaders to, and by the time that Peter goes, Nicholas, who the ball was for, had died, and Alexander II was now Tsar. And while he is in the corps of pages, he quickly becomes the best student there. He's a brilliant 15-year-old, and he stays there from when he's 15 till when he's about 19. While he's there, he's secretly continuing to learn about the political theory of anarchism and becoming more and more interested in it. Of course, he's keeping this from everyone at the corps who he can't trust, and certainly from the Tsar. Simultaneously, he and his brother are reading Darwin's Origin of Species, which has just recently come out. And they are discussing this new radical theory that's coming out of England about the origin of species and this new idea of evolution by natural selection. So he has got a lot going on when he's in the corps of pages. He's got to take all of the military courses that he's mandated to take. He's reading his political anarchy on the side, and he's discussing and learning about evolutionary biology with his brother. Nonetheless, he becomes the top student in the corps, and what that means is he became sergeant of the corps of pages. And the sergeant of the corps was the personal page to the Tsar of Russia. So there was no teenager in Russia who had more access and closer interactions with the Tsar than Peter Kropotkin. He liked Tsar Nicholas initially. He liked the idea that the serfs were going to be freed. He wasn't particularly happy the way it all played out, but he was happy that the Tsar was finally moving in that direction. He liked him personally, but he was very, very quickly beginning to think that this kind of form of government needs to go, and government needs to go, period, and more becoming an anarchist. So as he stays in the corps, at the end, when he's sergeant, in addition to being the Tsar's personal page, the sergeant has the first choice of positions when he graduates. So basically, the Tsar personally tells him he can have any choice position he wants for a 20-year-old or 19-year-old in Russia. And what Peter says, to the shock and dismay of his father and all of his relatives, is that what he wants to do is he wants to go to Siberia. And Siberia, parts of Siberia, particularly the Amur part, had only recently been annexed by Russia. And Kropotkin says he wants to go there, and he tells the Tsar that he wants to go there because he thinks he could be of service. He could help understand and promote Russian ideas in Siberia. But really, the reason he's going there's two reasons. First of all, he knows that the deeper he gets into anarchist philosophy, the further he needs to be away from where the seat of power in Russia is, because sooner or later they're going to start throwing anarchists in jail, and the further away he is, the better. And the other reason he goes there is after reading about Darwin and the origin of species, he also was a huge fan of Alexander Humboldt and this whole notion of exploring and doing natural history. And he thought this was a completely unexplored region, and he could have an adventure that was sort of like Darwin's adventure on the Beagle, except much, much colder. And so he got the Tsar to give him a position in Siberia, and on paper his job was he had to inspect prisons, and they were dreadful, and they tended to be filled even at that time with anarchists and troublemakers, and he hated everything about writing about these prisons, but he spent a lot of his time actually doing natural history. He studied both the human populations and the non-human populations everywhere he went. And he actually, at the end, ended up spending 5 years doing this natural history study in Siberia. And over those 5 years, going back and forth and crisscrossing back and forth across Siberia, he traveled 50,000 miles back and forth, up and down. A lot of it on dog sled, some of it on bumpy stagecoaches, most of it in extraordinarily difficult situations. He describes most of it being lying down in a sled, wrapped in fur blankets, inside and outside, when the temperature is 40 or 60 degrees below Fahrenheit. But somehow, as he does all of this, he's gathering information that's basically natural history information. And he's doing it in the most bizarre ways. For example, sometimes he goes to places and needs to get across frozen rivers. The peasants there know that he's an employee or he works for the Tsar, and they're terrified that if they get involved in helping him, for example, cross a frozen river, and something happens to him, that the Tsar will retaliate against that entire village. And so they would make him sign things like, I, the undersigned, hereby testify that Kropotkin was drowned by the will of God and through no fault of the peasants. And only then, after Kropotkin signed it, would they help him across. And he had all of these incredible adventures. So when he went there and to study natural history, having read Darwin, what he expected to find was a vicious competition-based societies among non-humans. So if you read Darwin's work, initially the way that people would interpret it was that natural selection will always favor competition. It will always favor any traits in organisms that make them better at being able to outcompete everybody else for food, mates, safe shelter, food, whatever it might be. And at that time, that was really the only way that people thought about how natural selection operated. It would always produce these kind of competitive scenarios. And this was the idea that was coming out of Victorian England at the time. And so Kropotkin was quite fond of Darwin's writings, and so when he went there, he really thought that that is what he would see, and he was looking for it. He was expecting to find it. Quickly, he began to write in his journal that even though he was looking for it, this is not what he was finding. He was not finding what we often talk about as a dog-eat-dog world, a world in which everybody is fiercely competing to get whatever resources there are out in the environment. Right? Instead, what Kropotkin found was something that he and a few others began calling mutual aid. Today, we would refer to this as cooperation and altruism, but Kropotkin referred to this as mutual aid. Later on, much later, these explorations are in the early 1860s, but 50 years later he writes a whole book on this. And when he writes the book, he describes what he saw these years in Siberia. And he writes that wherever he looked, wherever there was life in abundance, on the lakes, in the colonies of rodents, in the migrations of bird and deers, wherever he looked in Siberia, I saw mutual aid and mutual support carried on to an extent that made me suspect it a feature of the greatest importance for the maintenance of life, the preservation of each species, and its further evolution. So this is exactly the opposite of what most people at the time thought that the Darwinian process would lead to. Instead of competition and fierce battles between animals for access to food, what Kropotkin was seeing, he thought, was mutual aid and mutual support, individuals helping one another rather than competing with one another. So for example, he would write about animals giving alarm calls. In the lecture I gave last night, I showed some videos where we know that in certain species, a lot of squirrel species, for example, some individuals, when there's a danger in the environment, they stand up and they give this piercing alarm call, and everybody, all the other animals run for safety. And they give the call, and eventually they run for safety, but it's a really dangerous thing to do. You help everybody else at a real cost to yourself. Screaming to warn others is very dangerous when there's a predator around. And yet Kropotkin kept seeing these alarm calls, what he called mutual aid, what today we might call altruism or cooperation. He wrote of other instances like this, where ruminants or herds of horses would form a ring around the most vulnerable individuals in their group, the younger ones or the pregnant females or the older individuals, to protect them from danger. In this case, from wolves. Again, a very, very mutual aid, altruistic kind of behaviors. He saw instances over and over again of animals sharing food. Instead of fighting each other to the death for a piece of food, they were sharing food that they had found. He found them huddling together for warmth, which is a good way to increase your body temperature in an environment as nasty as Siberia. But again, you have to be interacting in a positive way in order for that kind of thing to work. If everybody's trying to rip each other's head off, you can't huddle for warmth. But if interactions are generally positive, you can. That was among the animals. And then when he went to a lot of these peasant villages, he saw mutual aid over and over again, that these villages seemed to be constructed on the whole notion of mutual aid. And he was really taken by this. He would write that the constructive work of these unknown masses, you never see it in the books that academics and intellectuals are writing, but it's the importance of this work in the growth of society that fully appeared to me before my eyes at this time. It's something you can't learn from books. And so already he's beginning to connect this altruism in non-humans, this mutual aid, to similar sorts of things in these human peasant villages. Right? And then he's also beginning to tie this to his thoughts on anarchy, because what he did was he began to notice that there was this relationship between how much mutual aid he would see in a peasant village and something about the state government. So basically, he would go into these peasant villages and interact with people, talk with them in the coffee houses and in the fields. And in some villages, all these little villages had some mutual aid. So the mutual aid might be a fraternity of people who work together in some guild or something like that, or a school for orphans, or something where people are contributing money from themselves to help the community. Some of these villages would have lots of that, and other villages would have some, but not as much. And he wanted to understand that variation. Why was there some mutual aid here in a village, but lots of mutual aid here in a village? And he began to realize that there was a positive correlation between the amount of mutual aid that he was seeing in a village and how far away that village was from the seat of political power. The further it was away from where the governing was taking place, and presumably that means the less government regulation that was present, the more people cooperated with each other. So it's an instance in which he's thinking about mutual aid, but now he's beginning to realize that mutual aid seems to be facilitated not by the presence of government, but by the absence of government, just like anarchists view the world. He writes that whether you're talking about humans or non-human animals, evolution favors aggregations of organisms that are trying to find out the best way of combining the wants of the individual with those of cooperation for the welfare of the species. So Kropotkin was not foolish. He did not think that in animals and in humans there was no selfishness, that there was no competition. He realized that there was, to some extent, that going on. His profound insight was that was only one part of what was going on. The other part was the balancing of that wants of the individual with the wants of the community. And he thought that natural selection was favoring some balance between those two things. Now, there's still an incredibly active debate in evolutionary biology about the extent that these two things are balanced. But the bigger point with respect to Kropotkin is he's the first person that even suggested that in any real way. Darwin hinted at it, but for Kropotkin it became central to everything he did. This notion of mutual aid being a critical part of animal and human society, even though we recognize their selfishness and competition as well. So he begins to develop these ideas in Siberia, 5 years there. Finally, when he finishes up with that, he actually has enough money and he's sort of freed from both his obligation to the Tsar and his obligation to his father, that he's able to go to university, which is something he wanted to do right from the start, but simply was not able to. So he goes over and he spends some time at St. Petersburg University after these 5 years in Siberia, where he's building up his ideas on mutual aid and anarchy. He goes to St. Petersburg University and he studies mathematics. And he's also translating philosophical works from English into Russian just for the fun of it. He's translating Herbert Spencer and other major philosophers. He's got his hands in sort of everything intellectual that you could think about. But mostly what he's doing is he's hanging around with a bunch of young anarchists at St. Petersburg University, where a lot of the anarchist movement was. It tended to be centered in the major universities, including St. Petersburg. Somehow, he got the university to allow him to take a 3-month visit to what is now part of Switzerland, the canton of Jura, which was basically the world headquarters for anarchist thinking. And he spent 3 months there interacting with all of the major anarchists of the world and then smuggling anarchist literature back into Russia when he left, which was a very, very dangerous thing for him to do. Now he's beginning to tie together his ideas on anarchy and evolution and mutual aid even more tightly. He's now beginning to make this argument that anarchy is going to be the next stage of human evolution. It's no longer just a political thing for him. It's now a biological phenomenon. And his arguments, there were a lot of details to the arguments he was making here. But at its heart, part of what drove this was 5 years seeing mutual aid among non-humans in Siberia and thinking that if these animals can display mutual aid, because there's no government or anything equivalent to government in animals. So you remove that, and what do animals do? In his eyes, they display mutual aid. There's no government, so what do you get? You get mutual aid. In his eyes is what he thinks. Surely, he argues, humans will reach that phase. With our superior intellectual abilities, it's only natural that eventually we will reach the phase where we realize that government is the problem, not the solution. We will throw it off, and anarchy will be the next phase of our biological evolution. Now, there were a lot of people who did not take kindly to this notion about anarchy, and they didn't really take kindly to his ideas on mutual aid either. But particularly, they didn't take kindly to his ideas on anarchy, and the Tsar had him arrested, even though the Tsar liked him. And eventually he got arrested after he actually gave a talk at the Russian Geological Society, so I had to skip over the fact that in addition to all of the natural history he did in Siberia, he also made major geological contributions. He was the first person to actually figure out the orientation of the mountain ranges in Siberia, and he was a major figure in geology. But he went to a geology meeting, they knew he was going there, he was on the list, they arrested him afterwards. They threw him into the Peter and Paul prison, which was where they threw the worst, most troublesome folks who were stirring up the people. And he spent 2 years there. And he spent it in a lonely cell in which he did his best to keep his sanity. And the only reason he actually was really able to do that was that his contributions to geology were so important that the Russian Geological Society, which was very powerful at the time, went to the Tsar and they begged the Tsar to let Peter have pencil and paper so that he could write up his findings on geology when he was in prison. Otherwise, this is what he was doing most of the time because they didn't give him anything else to do except sit there in the cell. He ends up getting quite sick physically and gets put into the infirmary, and while he's in the infirmary, he and a bunch of other prisoners decide they're going to make a break for it, that they're never going to get out. So Kropotkin thought eventually people will come to his aid and he'll get out. But after 2 years, he realized, if I don't try and get out of here myself, I'm never going to get out. The Tsar's never going to let me out. So they sit around and they try to hatch a plan to escape. Eventually, this plan gets written up in the New York Times and all over the world because it's quite a series of plans they tried. So he and his friends, their first idea was that every day outside of the Peter and Paul prison, generally around St. Petersburg, there were a lot of people who sold these red balloons to little children. And Kropotkin and his friends in prison had made contacts outside who were going to help them escape, but they needed to be able to coordinate what was going on inside the prison with the people on the outside who were going to help them. And the way they were going to coordinate it was they were going to have this woman buy a red balloon for her little child that was with her, and then she would let the red balloon out of her hand. It would fly up, and they would see it rise up over the prison wall, and that would be the signal that it was it was safe enough on the outside right then for them to escape. That was the time to do it. So it turns out that the day they planned to do it, there were no red balloons for sale on the streets outside of St. Petersburg, and that plan fell to pieces. Then they had a plan that was even more elaborate, okay? And this plan was drawn up later on and published in a newspaper, and it involved various conspirators that were doing different things. So there was one person that was a conspirator that was just walking around with a microscope to basically distract the police officers who would come up to them and ask him why they were walking around with a microscope, and then they would show them the microscope, and there would be something under there that looked kind of interesting that would distract the policeman. Right? There would be another conspirator that was going around asking all the authorities on the outside where there was a room that they could stay, anything to distract them from what might be going on that would be bad for the prison escape. There was another conspirator, and his job was to sit on the corner with a bowl of cherries, and he would spit out the cherry pits, and depending upon what direction he spit out the cherry pits, that was a signal to the other people on the outside who were helping that they should now signal Kropotkin and those people on the inside that it's time for them to escape. And the final signal, once the cherry pits were spit in the right direction, was that a violinist on the outside would play a mazurka like this. And when they heard the mazurka, they would make a break for it over the wall. Peter writes that he barely got out over the wall, and there was a carriage waiting for him on the outside. He jumped into the carriage and basically headed to the port and sailed over to England. This was huge, huge news in Russia. The Tsar posted, they put up posters for Kropotkin as a wanted criminal everywhere. It was such a big story that all these amazing rumors began to circulate. So the Tsar was having problems with his brother, who was the Grand Duke. They didn't like each other. And the rumor formed that the Grand Duke didn't like the Tsar so much that when an anarchist escaped from prison, he was the person who was actually driving the cart that took Kropotkin down to the port and got him onto the ship, which wasn't true, but it was a great rumor, and it demonstrates to you sort of how big a deal this was in Russia. So, because he was already very well known as an anarchist, he was very well known as a scientist, and he breaks out of jail. Now, he ends up going over to England and getting into this really interesting debate about the evolution of mutual aid and cooperation with arguably the most famous scientist in England at that time, who is a fellow by the name of Thomas Henry Huxley. So Huxley was Darwin's really good friend, and he was really the person who went around spreading Darwin's ideas. Darwin was not the kind of person who stood up in front of an audience often and discussed his ideas, and certainly not a public audience. He might do it occasionally for a scientific audience, but even then he was usually sick. But Huxley did it, and he loved it. And he was really the face of evolution for many people in England, because he was the one going to the pubs and giving public lectures to 2,000 people in a hall and teaching them about evolution and that sort of thing. And by the time Kropotkin gets over to England, Darwin has died, and Huxley is writing an obituary for Darwin. And in this obituary, he starts talking about both human and non-human mutual aid and the lack of it. And he goes on and on and on in this article, and I want to show you what Huxley says, because this article was what infuriated Kropotkin so much that he ended up writing a series of responses that turned into a book that became one of the most popular books in science in the first part of the 20th century. So what had happened was that Huxley wrote an article called The Struggle for Existence, and this was it was supposed to be basically an article celebrating Darwin's life, and the way he did it was by laying out some ideas that he thought represented Darwin's ideas on humans and animals. Okay, so it was supposed to be kind of an obituary, but it was really a science article. And it was published in a very interesting place. It was published in a newspaper journal that was called 19th Century. And this was the place where all of the intellectuals in England would publish. So for example, the 19th century often had articles by an ex-prime minister on some political issue that was going on. A famous children's writer by the name of Beatrix Potter, who wrote lots and lots of tales that are told all over the world. Beatrix Potter used to write her children's stories, and they would first be published in the 19th century. So a lot of people read this, not just scientists by any means. And in here, Huxley writes the following. From the point of view of the moralist, the animal world is on about the same level as a gladiator show, an ancient Roman gladiator show. The creatures are fairly well treated and set to fight. The strongest, the swiftest, and the cunningest live to fight another day. The weakest and the stupidest went to the wall, while the toughest and the shrewdest, those who were best fitted to cope with their circumstances, but not best in any other way, survived. Life was a continuous free fight, and beyond the temporary and limited relations of the family, the Hobbesian war of each against all was the normal state of existence. So if you remember back to your philosophy classes, Thomas Hobbes wrote that life was nasty, short, and brutish, although I might have gotten the order wrong. That's what he said. And basically, Huxley is saying that's right for non-humans as well. So what Huxley lays out in this article here is the view that many people in England had at the time still, which was that competition, fighting, shrewdness, toughness, that was what mattered, and that was all that mattered. And the only exception was sometimes you would see goodness among family members, but it wasn't very common. This, of course, is the exact opposite position to the position that Kropotkin has come to after spending 5 years in Siberia and then many years after that. The exact opposite. So what Kropotkin does is he starts writing a series of essays in 19th century showing the power of mutual aid to counter the arguments that Huxley has made here. And eventually what he did was he basically stapled together, I think, about 7 of these essays that ran about 20 to 30 pages long. They were significant stories. And he put them together, and that's what became his book, Mutual Aid, which was published in 1902. And that book became one of the most popular science books of the early 1900s. And it's in here that he takes all the articles he wrote for 19th century and tries to make the case for mutual aid. So let me just walk you through the way that he does this. The first chapter, and I think the second chapter as well, are devoted to the sort of things we were talking about with mutual aid among animals, right? So he sort of lays out the Darwinian struggle for existence that other people say is going on. He tries to show you that that struggle, he doesn't deny there's a struggle for existence. He simply thinks that mutual aid is a good way to survive, that it provides you with benefits that you wouldn't get otherwise. So he understands there's only so many resources and that there's a struggle. It's just that he thinks that cooperation is the solution to the struggle, not competition. Generally. And he goes through many of the examples we talked about in animals and then more. And he does this over 2 chapters which run, I think, about 50 pages. Chapter 3, he starts going into mutual aid in humans because Huxley also thinks that we're not particularly cooperative, not just animals, but that we're also not particularly cooperative. And the way that he does this is he talks about different stages of different types of human society. So at that time, although we would never do it today, people sort of thought of different societies around the world and through time as sort of different stages of human development towards modern human life. And so there was a sense that savages, okay, so savages, which you can look on the little table on the top, include Eskimos, Hottentots, people that lived in tribes that at the time Europe and Russia thought were full of these savages, what they called. Kropotkin first details, call them whatever you want. You see mutual aid all over the place. And he goes through lots and lots of these societies and goes through the anthropological literature demonstrating that if, when Hottentots are given resources, they divide them amongst themselves, a habit which was so well known that even Darwin wrote about it. He writes the harmony which that prevails in these villages of Polynesian inhabitants of the Pacific Islands. And over again, he goes to the Eskimos, he goes to other tribes in Africa that were called savages, and he shows, if you look, what they consistently display is mutual aid. Yes, there's war. Yes, there's competition. But mutual aid also plays a really, really important, undervalued role in these in these societies that he was calling savages. Well, everybody was calling us savages. The next chapter is on mutual aid in barbarians, which is a little bit different, believe it or not, than savages. And barbarians were sort of everybody up until the Middle Ages, from the birth of Christ up through the Middle Ages, and even before that. So say 1000 BC up through the Middle Ages was time of barbarians. But nonetheless, when you historically go through the record, and Kropotkin did, he was It's almost inconceivable to me how much this guy read. When you see in a moment all of the other things that he wrote about, it's just astonishing. But he went through the history literature, and he found over and over again these examples of mutual aid in these societies that we were calling barbarians. Common agriculture became the rule in the barbarian village. And by common agriculture, he means an area that is owned by everybody, where everybody's cattle and domesticated animals share it and graze on it, and it's owned by the community rather than an individual. And he argued that these kinds of commons were very, very you saw it all the time in these barbarian societies. And he went through many, many other examples of mutual aid in barbarians in that chapter. He was particularly fond of the medieval cities in terms of mutual aid. He thought in many ways that was the height, that was the pinnacle of mutual aid in humans so far. And so he would often talk about these medieval free cities as an organic being, an actual organism that grew naturally. He would talk about these free cities that existed everywhere from the coast of the Mediterranean to the North Sea to the Baltic, everywhere. There were these free cities, and in these free cities, what you were seeing was the same thing, over and over again happening. Everywhere, he argues, the same revolt took place, with the same features passing through the same phases. What you ended up were getting fraternities, friendships, guilds, or individuals working together to feed the poor, to house orphans, to produce a commons where everybody's cattle could live together. Over and over again, you see all these fraternities and guilds of leather makers, of pot makers, of whatever. This notion that you can do more as a group than you can do as an individual. And for Kropotkin, the medieval city, the free cities in medieval times, were a wonderful example of this. He realized there were all sorts of other nasty things happening in the Middle Ages, but nonetheless, the medieval city was a good example. And his last chapter was on mutual aid amongst ourselves, meaning currently, and currently was right at the start of the 1900s. And his favorite example of a relatively current case of mutual aid was the French Revolution, until it went bad. Before it went bad, he argued this was the classic way things happened. Small groups of people come together to throw off the shackles of a despotic government and to govern themselves in peaceful ways. Okay, and of course it all went bad, but before that happened, he argued that the French Revolution was a wonderful example of mutual aid, and then he tried to understand why it went bad. And at the end of the day, he wrote an 800-page book on the French Revolution that many consider to be one of the best historical versions of the French Revolution that was published. So after his book came out and a lot of his science papers came out, he became, and he was already known as one of the leading anarchists of the world, he became a sort of celebrity. And he ended up traveling around. He ended up coming to the United States because when he traveled around Europe, he tended to get arrested a lot. And so he decided that he would, so he was actually thrown in prison in France for another few years as a troublemaker, because, of course, no monarchies wanted anarchists coming there and stirring trouble. But he comes to the United States, and when he comes to the United States to talk, he's treated as a celebrity. The New York Times follows him around, and he goes around and he gives this tour that is really mind-blowing. I'm just going to walk you quickly through it. So he comes to the United States in 1897. So his mutual aid book is actually just about to come out, but all the articles that it was based on are already out. But before 1897, he had already published books, and big books, on, so mutual aid is about to come out. He wrote a whole book on the geography of Asia. He wrote an entire book on anarchy as a political philosophy. He wrote an entire book on anarchy and its relationship to science. He wrote an 800-page book on the French Revolution. He wrote a large book on socialism and communism. He liked the former, didn't like the latter. He wrote an entire book on the penal systems in Asia and Europe, both from when he was an investigator in Siberia and from when he was a prisoner in Russia and France. He wrote a book on the coming industrial revolution in Asia, and he actually became an expert on Russian literature from a literature perspective, not from a political perspective, and wrote an entire book on the state of Russian literature. So he comes to the United States as this kind of semi-celebrity, and he starts traveling around. Okay, and he goes to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the group that to this day produces the journal Science. And he talks about, there he just listens. He wants to see where the state of science is in the United States. So he goes to Washington to do that. Then he lectures about his time in Siberia to the National Geographic Society. Then he takes a train and he goes to New York and he lectures to a group of 2,000 people at a place called Chickering Hall. And he lectures on socialism and modern development. And they're so happy that he's there that they've made the ushers dress up in Russian costumes so that when everybody came in, they knew what was going on. Then he went back down to Philadelphia. He talked to 2,000 people about mutual aid and history in a large setting in Philadelphia. Then he went back up to, he went to Boston and he talked about mutual aid in savages and barbarians and mutual aid in the medieval society. And then he went to Harvard and talked about socialism. He went to the Industrial Club, the Women's Industrial Club of Cambridge, and talked to them about politics and economics. And then he gave a talk on Christianity and morality at a local church, but since he didn't think Christianity and morality were connected in any way, he refused to do it inside the chapel and would only do it inside the non-religious part of the church. Okay. Then he went back to New York City and talked about the philosophical and scientific basis of anarchism, the struggle for freedom in Russia, and the great social problems of our century. 4 years later, he gets invited back again to the United States. He talks about his book on Russian literature, and then he also talks about anarchism, its philosophical approach, and its ideals. He then goes down, that's pointing to the wrong spot. This is in New York. He talks to 4,000 people on the philosophy of anarchism. He goes and he visits the most famous anarchist who's in jail in the United States, Alexander Berkman, just to sort of tick off all of the anti-anarchists in the United States that he could possibly upset. He goes to visit Berkman and sits down and talks with him nicely and says all these wonderful things about what Berkman did, even though he was in jail for throwing bombs at people at anarchist meetings. He then heads out further. He goes to Chicago. He talks about the law of mutual aid. He talks about science and social questions. He talks about anarchism, and he talks about fields, factories, and workshops, which is an entire book he did on economics. And then he's getting ready to do a third tour of the United States. And what happens is our president at the time, President McKinley, was assassinated. And he was assassinated by an anarchist. And rumors began to spread that Kropotkin was involved with the assassination, which he wasn't. And he wasn't particularly a violent person, although I don't know that he was that upset when other people used violence to promote the ideals of anarchy. But nonetheless, what happened was, after McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist, we produced laws that made it illegal for anarchists to come into the United States, so Kropotkin couldn't come here. So instead, he goes back to England. And I'm going to finish up with you by discussing some of the problems that Kropotkin was facing in his later years when he was in England. So his ideas on mutual aid were really well established by now, and his thoughts on anarchy were really well established. But he still had a number of questions that he couldn't figure out the answer to. And he fundamentally wanted to answer these questions because he thought that it would help him, he thought that it would help us understand both mutual aid and the politics of anarchism. So I'm going to show you two of the problems that Kropotkin faced, and I want to talk about the solutions that he came up with for them. So he had two basic problems. The first one was a problem that in biology we would call a proximate problem. That is, a problem that is taking place right now in real time. And here what Kropotkin wanted to know was, he was convinced that animals and humans were displaying lots of mutual aid. But he wanted to know, what was it in real time? Like, what was the cue? What was it that we were picking up on in any given circumstance that then made us help others? In real time, what prompted us to make a particular act of kindness towards others, right? And then he had an evolutionary problem, and that problem was that mutual aid would often come about really quickly where it wasn't before. So he would sometimes see instances where there was very little mutual aid someplace. Then mutual aid was introduced, and then it spread really, really quickly, both in humans and non-humans. And he thought that it spread too quickly for the classic sort of Darwinian, slow but gradual evolutionary change. And he wanted to understand what could possibly have allowed mutual aid to spread quickly from an evolutionary perspective. Okay, so let's do the first problem. In real time, when there's the possibility for individuals to act in display mutual aid, what prompts them to do that? And for this, Kropotkin turns to a very, very strange ally. And that ally is Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, which was probably on Kropotkin's 5 worst books ever written in the history of civilization, because he thought capitalism was a curse, and he was a socialist. If he was anything, he was an anarchist, but in terms of if you were going to pick a sort of philosophy that he supported besides anarchism, it would have been socialism, because that's more of a sort of economic distribution, not a state-sponsored economic distribution, which is why he didn't like communism. But he despised capitalism, and Adam Smith is the father of capitalism through The Wealth of Nations. But it turns out that Adam Smith wrote another book that most people don't know about, but philosophers might tell you is actually more important. And that book is called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And here, Adam Smith wants to understand moral sentiments. He wants to come up for a theory for why it is that we display moral sentiments. Why do we ever act in a moral way? And Kropotkin describes Adam Smith's ideas on morality in an article that he wrote called Anarchist Morality. And what Kropotkin says is, think about it like this. You see a man beat a child. You know the beaten child suffers. Your imagination causes you yourself to suffer the pain inflicted upon the child. Or perhaps its tears, its little suffering face tells you what it's going through. And if you're not a coward, you rush at whoever it is that's doing the beating and you rescue that individual. This is essentially Adam Smith's idea, that the reason that we display morality is because we're empathetic. We can put ourselves in the position of those that are suffering. We can feel the suffering they feel, and in order to reduce that, we help them. Because when they're no longer suffering, we're no longer empathetically feeling the pain that they're feeling, and we feel better. This is a very kind of rough summary of Adam Smith's ideas. What Kropotkin says is that helps us understand mutual aid in humans. We're empathetic. If someone's in trouble, we help them because we feel the trouble that they feel. And we don't want to feel what that feels like. So Kropotkin says this example by itself explains almost all the moral sentiments, that Adam Smith was right. Then, the last bit after the 3 dots, Kropotkin says, Adam Smith's only mistake was not to have understood that the same feeling of sympathy, what I'm calling empathy, in its habitual stage also exists amongst animals as well as men. He thought that animals were capable of empathy as well as humans, and because they could put themselves in the place of others who might be feeling terror or danger, because they could then feel that themselves, they help that individual because you don't like to feel terror and fear yourself. And if you help that individual, they don't feel it, so you don't feel it. Now, last night, I actually talked about some of the, I talked about one study. There might be a handful where we actually now have found empathy in non-humans. So Kropotkin may have been right about this, that this empathy is in fact present in non-humans as well as humans. But for him, that was why it was in real time that we went about helping somebody who was in trouble. The second problem, and the last one I'm going to do, and then we'll wrap it up, is that, again, there were many instances in both humans and non-humans where Kropotkin found that relatively shortly after mutual aid was introduced to a place where it wasn't, that mutual aid spread very, very quickly. And he really did think that a lot of the mutual aid in animals was essentially genetic. And the way that we typically think about evolutionary change is a very, very slow process. It takes many, many generations to build up real change. And yet what Kropotkin was seeing when it came to mutual aid was it was happening so fast that classic Darwinian slow, gradual process it couldn't explain what was going on. So what was the solution? Well, here Kropotkin turns to another famous scientist by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And Lamarck had, even before Darwin, was the first person to come up with sort of a full-blown theory about how evolutionary change occurred. But Lamarck had a very different idea than Darwin. Lamarck, I'm sorry, I want to go to the next slide here. Okay, let me go. Lamarck basically developed this idea that, if we go to this last bullet here, that's known as Lamarckian inheritance, or the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, I don't want to bore you with the details of exactly how this works, but the basic idea in Lamarckian inheritance is this, that the traits that you pick up from use and disuse during your lifetime are then passed on to your offspring through what today we would think of as genetic means. So, for example, the classic Lamarckian example is the giraffe's neck. So what a Lamarckian approach would say was, okay, how do you explain the evolution of really, really long necks? And the Lamarckian approach goes like this. Some individual giraffes are able to stretch their necks out a bit longer than other giraffes. And they keep doing this because that gets them food higher up on the trees, so they get more food. Now, what Lamarck says is the actual constant stretching and use of those neck muscles not only produces a giraffe with a longer neck simply because it's stretching its muscles, but that it will produce offspring, young, who themselves will be born with longer necks because of the use of those muscles in their parents. That's a very non-Darwinian view of how evolution takes place. But it allows for change to occur really, really quickly, because a single generation of stretching your neck can translate into offspring having a really stretched neck in one generation. Now, it turns out this is completely wrong, but it was a very reasonable hypothesis when Lamarck made it, and even when Kropotkin adopted it, it was still thought of as a real possibility. And so this whole notion, you have giraffes with short necks, they stretch. The stretching makes longer necks. Their babies then have these inherited longer necks. So what Kropotkin said was the same thing is going on with mutual aid. As soon as one generation begins to display it, if some individuals are displaying it a little bit more than others, that tendency, that use of mutual aid will produce offspring in the next generation who already will begin to display more mutual aid from the start than their parents did at the start, because their parents were using mutual aid, and by Lamarckian inheritance, their offspring would display high levels of it right away. So he turns to Lamarck, and he's wrong. But at the time, it was a really respectable approach to the problem. So I just want to sort of wrap it up this way. Kropotkin was right about some things, and it turns out that he was wrong about some things. He was right that mutual aid plays a major role in the process of natural selection. He was right that cooperation and altruism are widespread. He was probably wrong in terms of how important he thought it was. It may not be quite as important as he thought it was, but it's certainly important. He was right when it came to the possibility that non-humans can display empathy. He was wrong when it came to turning to Lamarckian inheritance. He was arguably one of the first people to make a legitimate claim that one can use biological thinking to address political issues. Maybe he was wrong in terms of what would actually play out on the stage of human civilization over the next 100 years. He thought that anarchy would already have been prevalent by the time he died. It wasn't. But, I mean, you know, you can make a list of things he was correct about and things he was incorrect about. But I think the bigger point is that he sort of single-handedly made the field of science, and particularly evolutionary biology, recognize that competition and selfishness are not the only things that work, that under certain circumstances, acting in a mutual aid way towards those in your society can be favored by natural selection. When he died in the early 1920s, for a while people forgot about Kropotkin and his ideas on mutual aid in particular. They never forgot his ideas on anarchy. He's always been a hero to anarchists, but they forgot his ideas on mutual aid. And then about 20 years ago, people began to look again. And because there was this sort of resurgence on work dealing with cooperation and altruism in non-humans. And at first, people just didn't know about Kropotkin's work. Then they discovered it, and they realized that many of the things they were working on, Kropotkin had talked about and hypothesized about 100 years earlier. And so now, what we're seeing is that the hundreds of labs around the world where people are studying altruism and cooperation in animals and humans are now really beginning to pay attention to what Kropotkin had to say. And that's nice, because this is a fellow who really sort of revolutionized the way we think about science and the way we think about politics. And so it's my delight to have the chance to sort of talk to you, to just give you a quick overview of who Peter Kropotkin was and what he did. And I can stop now and take questions and chat with you. And I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.